Now, what historians will tell you is when the Republicans elected an anti-slavery president, the South seceded. And you're supposed to believe that they loved slavery so much that the mere whiff of anti-slavery drove them out. None of this stuff is mentioned, that they had to listen to leading Republican leaders say this was a sectional party, and the Republican Party got no votes in the South. It was a sectional party. Now, it was clear to the South that the North would use its majority in Congress to pursue its interests, even if it meant wrecking the Southern export trade. Accordingly, South Carolina seceded, and Congress immediately raised the tariff to 47% average on dutiable goods on March 6, 1861, before Fort Sumter. Lincoln said that South Carolina could stay in the Union if it liked, but he would collect the revenue. Like Rome, the North would live by tribute. Lincoln sent troops to Fort Sumter, where the tariff was collected. South Carolina resisted paying tribute to the Union, and as their fathers before them had done, they drove the tax-collecting military from the fort with no casualties. None of this had anything whatsoever to do with the moral issue of slavery. If you go to Charleston on East Bay Street, right on the water, you'll see the biggest building there, a huge marble building, U.S. Customs House. Look at it sometimes. It kind of looks like the Lincoln Memorial. Okay, I'm not going to read any more about the tariff business. I think you get the point of that. Lincoln was a Hamiltonian mercantilist, which you'd learned from Clay. I want to turn now to the Northern abolitionist argument that secession of the North was the best way to solve the problem of slavery, and Jeffrey Hummel, of course, has written a wonderful book on this, Emancipating Slaves and Enslaving Free Men. To appreciate this, let us consider what would most likely have happened if the South had not seceded. Now, again, our subject is the moral issue of slavery. This is what we're thinking about. The constitutional amendment making it impossible to change the Constitution to allow Congress to interfere with slavery would have been ratified by the states. No question about it. Slavery would last as long as the states wanted it to, and the federal government would have no power. How long did Lincoln think it might last? He said it might last a century. He just didn't want it to go west. He didn't want any blacks in the West. That was the problem. But in the South, it could last a century, work its way out. He drew up a private emancipation bill for Delaware, which was never published, in which the apprenticeship period was quite long. On his scheme, slavery would not have been eliminated until 1914. In his State of the Union address, December 1st, 1862, he proposed what would have been another 13th Amendment to the Constitution that required slavery be abolished January 1st, 1900. His proposed 14th Amendment would compensate slaveholders who had remained loyal to the Union, and his 15th Amendment would have provided money for deportation of Africans out of the United States. These were presented before the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Had the South stayed in the Union, slavery would have had an ironclad protection and could have easily stretched into the 20th century if Southern states had desired it. But would they have desired it? What would have been the prospects of emancipation in the South had the Confederacy secured its independence? It is reasonable to think that the South would have abolished slavery in a reasonable period of time, and probably sooner than the schedule projected by Lincoln. By the 1880s, slavery had entirely vanished from the Western Hemisphere. Only in Haiti in the United States was its abolition accompanied by violence. There had long been an abolitionist tradition in the South, especially in Virginia. By 1830, there were more abolitionist societies in the South than in the North. In 1832, the Virginia legislature was called by the governor to do something about slavery. It passed a resolution to abolish slavery in Virginia, but ran into difficulties when writing the statute. The bill was tabled. It was just at this time that the abolitionist frenzy swept down from the North, urging immediate and uncompensated emancipation. The circulation of pamphlets urging a slave uprising, poisoning water in the wells, murdering the families of planters in their sleep, as John Brown did and was praised for doing, did not strengthen the moderate forces of abolition in the South. Thomas Hart Benton, who had worked to secure the right of a jury trial for slaves in Missouri, bitterly complained that Northern abolitionist agitation had blocked further reforms. Serfdom, a European form of slavery, was abolished in England not by statute, but over centuries by judicial review under the common law. A great deal of Southern jurisprudence was rooted in this principle. Now let me explain it. The principle was laid down in common law by Chief Justice Lord Mansfield in Somerset's case, 1771, namely that slavery, being a violation of natural law, could be justified only by positive statute, and that such statutes must be strictly construed in the light of natural law. So if you had any wiggle room, you nudged the statute for interpretation, you nudged it in the direction of natural law. To take an instance, a Virginia statute provided that, quote, slaves which shall hereafter be brought into this commonwealth and kept therein 1 year or so long, at different times it shall amount to 1 year, shall be free, end quote. But the statute had a proviso that excluded a slaveholder from another state who had become a citizen of Virginia and took a specified oath within a certain period of time. In Murray v. McCarty, 1811, Judge Joseph Cable construed the proviso strictly so as to grant a slave, Nancy Murray, her freedom. Chief Justice William Gaston of the North Carolina Supreme Court in State v. Manuel, 1838, carried the principle of strict construction in the direction of freedom so far as to hold that whenever a slave became free by any lawful means, he also became a citizen of his state with the same rights as other citizens. Now recall that Lincoln was opposed to making black citizens in his state. He said, quote, the state of Illinois has the power, to have the power to make black citizens. I should be opposed to the exercise of it, end quote. Dred Scott sought his freedom and that of his wife and daughters in a suit brought before the Circuit Court of Missouri. The Southern Court granted Scott his freedom and his family, basing the decision on a long chain of precedents in Southern state courts rooted in Lord Mansfield's ruling in the Somerset case of 1771, that a slave entering territory where slavery is prohibited by law is instantly free. Scott lost his freedom when the case went to the Supreme Court of the United States on appeal in 1857. So you have a lot of cases where slaveholders lose in the state courts in the South, and then they win when they appeal to the federal courts. Free blacks flourished in the South as businessmen, slaveholders. There were a number of slaveholders. About 6% of free blacks were slaveholders. 1/4 of the blacks of New Orleans were free. In many places, especially urban areas, slavery was developing into an apprenticeship system, and slaves were able to buy or work out their freedom. William Gilmore Simms of Charleston, South Carolina, was the greatest Southern literary figure and planter. He thought slavery was a benevolent institution, but he had no difficulty in abandoning it either should circumstances change. In the 1850s, he argued that slavery would be eliminated in the border states in about 20 years. His reason was that the border states, quote, will become manufacturing, end quote. Its elimination in the Deep South, he thought, would take longer. His prediction was reasonable. By 1860, about half the blacks in Maryland were free, not by statute, but by having purchased their freedom through apprenticeship. Just a few other examples. Well, I won't mention Jefferson Davis's wife adopted a young black boy, 7 years old, who was being abused. He was an orphan. She took out papers for his freedom, and they adopted him into the family. He lived, slept, and ate and played with the Davis children as a member of the family in the Confederate White House during the years they were in Richmond. The Union Army seized him by force when Davis was captured, and despite Mrs. Davis's efforts over the years to find him and to, quote, look after Jim's education, end quote, he was never heard from again. You can read the letters the children wrote back and forth to him and about him. to find him and to, quote, look after Jim's education, end quote, he was never heard from again. You can read the letters the children wrote back and forth to him and about him. That Lincoln, who never did anything in Illinois to improve the conditions of blacks, would have freed and adopted a black orphan and raised him up with his own children in the starkly segregated north of Washington is unimaginable. Finally, the long-suppressed story of blacks who identified themselves as Southerners, were loyal to the Confederacy, and saw the war as an opportunity to improve their condition is gradually becoming known. Blacks were used by Confederates both as workers and as troops before they were so used by the North. Blacks were everywhere in the Confederate Army. When white regiments marched off the war, they were often accompanied by an equal number of blacks. For example, there were some 30,000 body servants in the Army of Northern Virginia alone. Given the informality of Confederate units, some of these and other blacks served in military capacities. An Afro-American scholar recently observed, quote, when you eliminate the black Confederate soldier, you've eliminated the history of the South. We share a common heritage with white Southerners who recall that era. We shared in the plantation scheme of things as well as the forces that fought to keep them, end quote. Nor should this be surprising, as another Afro-American scholar observed, quote, students of African American history should have been able to predict with a great degree of certitude that some, if not most, black Southerners would support their country, as did most white Southerners during the Revolutionary War. Black and white fought on both sides, demonstrating that it is possible to hate the system of slavery and love one's country, end quote. Reverend L. Jordan, another African American pioneer in black Confederates, has estimated that up to 25%, 65,000 out of 261,000 free Negroes in the South, and 15%, 600,000 out of 4 million slaves, actively supported the South in its struggle for independence. And it was this use of blacks that so irritated Northerners and urged Lincoln to arm blacks, because here the South are using the blacks. So we need to subvert their war effort. Early in the war, Confederate commanders such as Patrick Claiborne had argued for arming blacks. As early as August 1863, the Jackson Mississippian insisted that slavery should not be, quote, a barrier to our independence. If it is found in the way, if it proves an insurmountable object to the achievement of our liberty and separate nationality, away with it, let it perish, end quote. Later, the Confederate cabinet agreed to abolish slavery 5 years after the end of hostilities in exchange for British and French recognition. Now, finally, in the last year, the Congress authorized raising 300,000 black troops. Some states were already raising black troops. Jefferson Davis issued Order Number 14, which required that slaves be fully emancipated and treated equally with whites. Quote, no slave will be accepted as a recruit unless with his own consent and with the approbation of his master by a written instrument conferring as far as he may the rights of a free man. And again in the order he says, quote, all officers are enjoined to a provident, considerate, and humane attention to whatever concerns the health, comfort, instruction, and discipline of these troops, and to the uniform observance of kindness, forbearance, and indulgence in their treatment of them, and especially that they will protect them from injustice and oppression, end quote. And unlike black Union troops, they received equal pay. Okay, let me just end now because we're getting to the... what is missing from nearly all American historiography is the humanity of the South. I mean, the South aren't human beings. They're just cardboard figures stuck as in a Byzantine mosaic to explain American, self-congratulatory American nationalism. There aren't any blacks there that love their country and would be willing to move up and help. There were no Southerners who could rethink things. They were just stuck in this artificial creation that American nationalism needs. There were 10,000 Jews that fought in the Confederacy. The 5 civilized Indian tribes of Oklahoma fought for the Confederacy. They were represented in the Confederate Congress, and in a rare act of magnanimity in American Indian relations were promised a state, not a federal reservation, but their own state. Indians would have their own state. if the Confederacy gained its independence. Okay. Nearly all American historiography after 1865 is nationalist. This is what we've got to fight. And based on the moral assumption that the Union should have been preserved at all costs. In the 19th century, the heyday of empire and wars of unification and consolidation, an American empire might have seemed something worth trying. But we have learned since then, through fatal experience, about the evils of vast-scale modern states and what they bring in their wake. Libertarians should begin a new historiography rooted in the moral proposition that secession in 1860 was a good thing. It was the only rational and humane solution to all the problems confronting the Federation at that time. When two men are about to come to blows, it's best to separate them. To write the history from the assumption that the peaceful dissolution of the Union in 1860 was a good thing would bring to light a vast array of facts and moral possibilities and spectacular moral losses that have been hidden from view. This is what a paradigm shift does. It brings new things out. It would open up new political possibilities that are today closed off because of the limits, because the limits of politics are in large part the limits of human historical self-understanding. A lack of moral imagination prevents us from even entertaining this thought. A disability brought on by over a century of state-enforced nationalist propaganda. How, might we ask, could there be two unions in a land from sea to shining sea? Old 19th century nationalist habits are hard to break, even when their rationale has vanished. But suppose America had conquered Canada, as was attempted on at least 2 occasions. Suppose now that the Canadian states and legally called conventions of the people should secede, leaving Alaska disconnected from the continental United States. One can hear the objections. Such an arrangement could never work. Canada would not be viable. What about defense? There would be constant war between the two states, as in Europe. And what about detached Alaska? But in fact, the arrangement works quite well. Every possible scenario brought forth to exhibit the horrors that would have occurred if secession of the South had been allowed are dwarfed by the actual horrors that occurred in suppressing it. Now let me just read this last passage, a little longer than passage. Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, had been a Unionist who nevertheless believed in the right of the state to secede. After the war, he looked into the future and thought he saw a dark era of consolidationism emerging in Europe and the modern world, what we would later know as eventually totalitarianism. And he took comfort in the fact that the South had not only resisted this disposition of the modern state to centralize power, but had erected constitutional principles to prevent it. If you want to know why the South seceded, just read the Confederate Constitution. It's a constitution designed to prevent decentralization. Don't pay any attention to the pundits. Don't listen to anything Stevens or Davis. Just read the Constitution. That's why they seceded. Then he said this, quote, depend upon it, echoing the language of Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists, quote, there is no difference between consolidation and empire. No difference between centralism and imperialism. If the worst is to befall us, if our most serious apprehensions and gloomiest forebodings as to the future in this respect are to be realized, if centralism is ultimately to prevail, if our entire system of free institutions as established by our common ancestors is to be subverted, and an empire is to be established in their stead, if that is to be the last scene of the great tragic drama now being enacted, then be assured that we of the South will be acquitted not only in our own consciences, but by the judgment of mankind, of all responsibility for so terrible a catastrophe and from all the guilt of so great a crime against humanity. End quote. Stevens had no idea how great the crimes against humanity would be that future modern consolidationisms would have to answer for, nor how long it would take for historians to free themselves from the legitimating myths and ideologies in which consolidationism has wrapped itself.